will you be, okay, there you go. Thank you. All right, so let's start with our invocation and prayer. So if everyone will just take a deep breath and connect to their hearts and be into their inner self. Om Gajananam Bhutaganaadisevitam Kapitthajambhufalasaravbhakshitam Umasutam Shokavinashakaranam Namami Vigneshwarapadapangajam. Om Shri Mahaganapataye Namaha. Shadananam Kungumaraktavarnam Mahamatim Divyamayuravahanam Rudrasya Sunam Surasainyanatham Guham Sadaham Sharanam Prapadye. Om Ajnanathimirantasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshuram Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Ananda Samsara Samudratara Naukayitabhyam Guru Bhakti Dabhyam Vairagya Samrajyat Pujanabhyam Namo Namah Shri Guru Padukabhyam Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Dhanvantaraye Murtaye Amrita Kalasha Hastaya Sarvamaya Vinashanaya Trailokyanataya Shri Mahavishnave Swaha. All right, let's begin. So today is the second part of an introduction to Jyotish. And I know that this material is very complex, as you can see, and thank you to everyone who shared on the forums very honestly and openly. And I hope that we will all continue to stay humble to this science and not arrive at any conclusions, right? Because it's almost like saying after 1 or 2 months of studying Ayurveda that we're ready to treat clients. It's the same way. We have to have a 360-degree picture. So please know that anything that you're receiving from through my words is just a very small fraction of this amazing and vast and just really mind-boggling science, right? So today we're going to cover grahas, bhavas, a little bit more in context. We'll review the Lagna, sun sign, moon sign, and grahas based on some of the questions that I saw on the forum. Jyotish style, chart styles. And then we'll get into Rashi and Bhava and their characteristics, and then a few more items about grahas. So please stay open and just receive. And if you need to listen to the lecture a couple more times, please do, right? Again, this is not meant to turn you all into astrologers. This is meant to give you a perspective only when we look at our clients, right? To come from a place of more compassion, to be humble to your own self, and so on. So I hope this will widen your perspective and give you more of a broad angle lens when you look at your clients, and that's what this is intended to do. Okay, so getting into this, qualifications of a good Jyotishi. Sage Parashara says that a good Jyotishi must be deft in Ganita, which is mathematical astronomy, and Hora, which are all the texts essentially, as well as Sanskrit and grammar, and Nyaya, logic, right? Must be intelligent, capable of deriving good inductions and deductions. And so this is really key, right? He must be a knower of desha, place and land, and kala, all instances of time, and jitendriya must be a practicing brahmachari. So as you can see, a Jyotishi cannot just know their local place and land and just their local time. They need to be able to infer and deduct where they, the land and time and place of of anybody that's coming to them. And some of that requires a subtle sense of seeing, the darshana, that is beyond normal sight sometimes. So just to review from our last lecture, I hope everybody understands that graha, which is a planet, is not the same as rashi, and it is not the same as bhava, right? They all have different metaphors, if you will. Lagna, as you already have now, hopefully, some of you, I think, are still a little bit confused about this. So your Lagna is your ascendant, your rising sign, your first house, etc. So if you think about it, and I'm going to draw this metaphor frequently, you're in a building of which you're in an apartment, right? And the front door to your apartment is your Lagna, okay? Rashi is the sign or the color or the quality of the house, right? And that's rendered by the owner or ruler of the house. So your first house or your Lagna could very well be Aries, or it could be Gemini, or it could be Scorpio, or it could be Aquarius. Whatever that first house is represents who you are in the world, how the world perceives you. And the color of you, if you will, of your personality is rendered by the Lord of the sign that the first house is. So if it is Aries, then the Lord of that sign is Mars, and you will have a Mars-like quality to you. It could be the higher vibration of Mars, it could be the lower vibration of Mars. Either way, that is the color you're going to have. The sun sign is the Rashi where the sun is sitting, and the moon sign is where the moon is sitting. And so the sun represents the journey of your soul. The sun represents the journey of self. And the moon represents the journey of your mind, your mental nature, right? And Tamara, you're asking, how do you know the color of the Lord? Well, I'm using color as a metaphor, right? So when you think of Mars, what's the first color that comes to mind? He is a fiery planet, right? So think in terms of metaphors, because sometimes we in our limited minds are unable to grasp concepts without using symbols and archetypes, right? And I'll get into the Lord of each of the houses, so let's not jump ahead, so stay with me here. I'm going to get into that into this lecture. So when you look at a graha, when you look at a house, if you will, each bhava, each house, and again, I'm going to get into this in this lecture here. It could be the first house, second house, third house, fourth house, etc. And they don't have to be in the natural order. So in the natural zodiac, you know that the first house is Aries, the second house is Taurus, the third house is Gemini. But that's not necessarily the case for somebody with a Gemini ascendant. A Gemini ascendant is going to have the first house as Gemini, so their second house is going to be Cancer. Their third house is going to be Leo, and so on and so forth. So I hope you get that difference. So when I refer to the first house in the natural zodiac, I'm referring to Aries as the first house because that is the first constellation into which the sun rises in the east. Okay, also, when we look at a house, we also look to see who is in that house, who are the tenants of the house, who is the landlord of that house. So just because you're in an apartment, it doesn't mean that you own the apartment, but you sort of do, right? But the real landlord of that apartment is somebody else, right? So that's how you think of the lord of that sign, if you will. So the message I'm trying to convey to you is that you can't just look at one component at a time. That's not how this is. So it's almost like Western medicine. If somebody comes to you with knee pain, you're just looking at the knee and all the joints in the knee without really taking into consideration, oh, the knee is connected to the femur, is connected to the hip bone, is connected to the sacrum, is connected to the spine, is connected to the cervical spine, right? So if you don't understand that holistic picture, then you end up by the wayside of just looking at something just for what it is without taking the bigger picture into context. So I hope you're beginning to see how you need to sort of shift your perspective to a much larger picture and not just kind of dissect one thing down or one concept down to its little minuscule parts. Okay, now the other concept that I did not cover in the last lecture is that the sun and Mercury are always within 28 degrees of each other. So you know the Mercury is the closest planet to the sun, and he rotates the fastest, or revolves around the sun the fastest. Now, in some cases, right, you may always see Sun and Mercury in the same house or in the same sign, but in some cases they can also be in neighboring signs, but never more than 28 degrees from each other, right? But when Mercury is too close to the Sun, as it's prone to be, then Mercury can be in combust. So the same thing happens. If a planet, any planet, is too close to the Sun, then that planet is in combust. So what does combust mean? That the Sun has burnt up all the higher qualities of that planet, right? And in a metaphor, what does this mean to the human being? What that means is that the false ego has taken over the higher qualities of the planet. So for example, if Mercury is combust, what are the higher qualities of Mercury? Intellect, reasoning, deduction, logic, right? To be able to discern and judge good from bad, to separate pure from impure. Well, if the sun has burnt all of that up, then all of a sudden you've identified yourself as a supremely intellectual person. The superego takes over. Oh, I'm so smart, I'm so intelligent, and nobody's better than me. That kind of false sense of self. So that's what Jyotish shows you. And I know we don't want to see the lower qualities of ourselves, but it is so important in our self-awareness process, in that journey to knowing ourselves, our soul, that we also know what our lower qualities are, right? Because if you ask anybody on the planet, oh, do you know you're a bad person? Well, no, they don't know that they're a bad person, because they all are aspiring to be the best version of themselves. Even if you go talk to a criminal, they're not going to say, I'm a bad person, because they did their action for something that they thought would make them happy. So in the same way, don't falsify your sense of self by thinking that we're all just great people and that all we have are higher qualities of ourselves. We should know that we also vibrate with the lower qualities of our personalities and the planets in our house. So please be aware of that. And combust occurs when different planets are within 8 degrees of the sun, but really the degree of combust varies from planet to planet. And that's a very technical concept. I don't want to get into that, right? Because that's more for somebody who's going down the path of being an astrologer, and that's a little bit outside of the scope of this class. The other thing I'd like to touch on are the motion of planets. And again, this will become apparent as we get into the bhavas and the signs. All planets will aspire to go in direct motion, right? In one motion. And at times, depending on where that planet is, behind the sun or near the sun or between the earth and the sun, various planets will have an apparent movement of going backwards. And I encourage you guys to get on YouTube and look at videos of defining, what retrograde or retrogression means, so you understand that, the physical movement. So remember, we are geocentric. We're on the planet Earth looking up at the skies. And so the planets are not literally going backwards, but from our standpoint on Earth, it appears as though the planet is going backwards. Well, what does that mean when a planet goes retrograde or is in retrogression? That means that the effect and the influence of that planet has just strengthened and has increased in its effect, right? And in some cases, that can be negative, or that can be felt in a negative way. And in some cases, it can be felt in a positive way. Again, it all depends in context. We don't just look at that by itself, right? Rahu and Ketu are the two planets that are always in reverse motion, because their direct motion is always going backwards in the house. And again, that will become apparent as we go through the bhavas. Okay, so covering the styles of Jyotish charts. So there are many different styles of Jyotish in India, actually, and I'm just sort of showing you the 3 out of, like, I think 5 or 6 styles, and we will focus on either the North Indian or South Indian. And because I have been studying the South Indian style, I tend to favor that more. And there are differences here, right? So as you can see, on the left is a diamond-shaped chart, and in the middle is sort of the square block chart. And then you have the Eastern Indian style chart, which is used in the states of Orissa and Bengal. And Bengal charts look slightly different, but very similar to this, right? But effectively, they're all the same. They're not different. They just are depicted in a different way. So in the North Indian style, the bhavas are always fixed, which means no matter what the sign is, that first house is always going to be the topmost diamond. And in this case, the movement is counterclockwise. So if your first house or your rising sign or your lagna is right there in the topmost diamond, the second house is to the left of it. The third house is to the left of it again. So as you can see, it goes in counterclockwise motion, right? In the South Indian style chart, however, the Rashi and the bhavas are fixed. So Aries is always that second block. The Rashi is fixed. So the Aries is always in that second block. Taurus is always in that third block. Mithuna, which is always in that third block, and then you go downward. So you can see now we're moving in a clockwise motion. Now your first house is not always in Aries, obviously. So if you're a Gemini ascendant, you know, your ascendant is going to be in that third block. So I hope you're starting to see the styles. And I have not studied the Eastern Indian style chart, so I'm not even going to comment on it. I just wanted you guys to see what that looks like. So as I was referring to the motion of the planets, planets move in direct motion through the signs and houses. So for example, if we look at the South Indian chart, planets are always going to move from Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, etc. in that clockwise motion. When a planet goes retrograde, it goes backwards from direct motion. And Rahu and Ketu are always moving backwards. So I hope that makes sense, right? And in the natal chart, your natal chart, which is referred to as Janma Kundali or Janma Jatak and things like that, that's always referred to as your Rashi chart. There's another style of Jyotish that is also in India called Nadi Jyotisham, which is an amazing, amazing science. So when you go to a Nadi Jyotishi, they take your thumbprint, and what they do is they have all the history of every human being on the planet listed on palm leaves. And the story is that Lord Shiva told Goddess Parvati, his wife, the history and the journey of every soul on the planet and all the lessons that they had to learn. And believe me, when you go to one of these people, you know, they don't want you to say anything about yourself. They will just ask you questions where you just say yes or no. So, you know, they'll ask you if your first name is with a G, you know, is it Gata, Jala, whatever, you know. And so then they go back and they get all these old palm leaves and they come to you and they start reading off these things about your parents and your siblings and your life history, and your jaw just drops and you're thinking, wait a minute, these palm leaves were written well before I was born. How does this happen, right? So you begin to appreciate the context of your journey as a human being on the planet in this lifetime, and not self-identify so much with your mind and your ego, right, as though you're in control because your story has already been written. Again, that beautiful Arabic word I was referring to is maktub, that refers, it is already written, your destiny has already been written. And it's a very humbling journey, actually. Okay, so a little bit more about North Indian and South Indian charts. And this is just to further show you the difference, right? So again, the houses occupy the fixed positions in a North Indian chart, and they go anti-clockwise. And the signs depend, right? Again, the first house need not always be Aries. It can be Virgo, it can be Libra, anything, right? And so you always know in a North Indian chart that that topmost diamond is your first house. To me, I'm not so comfortable looking at the North Indian style. It takes me a little longer to figure things out again. I use the North Indian chart to get a view of the kendras, and I'm not going to get into that because, again, that's a technical concept. It is not relevant to you. Some of you touched on it in your comments, but again, I don't want to confuse people with a bunch of concepts. Again, in the South Indian chart, And I thought this was a beautiful picture, by the way. It shows the symbols of each of the signs. And again, I'm going to ask you to kind of start exploring the symbology of each of the rashis, right? The signs are in a fixed position, and, you know, they go in clockwise motion. All right. Moving on. Here's a sample chart of the great Albert Einstein, just to again show you the difference, right, in South Indian and North Indian chart, right? Now, Albert Einstein was a Gemini ascendant, and if you look at the South Indian chart, don't be confused. All that's written up, the planets are up on the topmost corner of each of the blocks, telling you who the Lord, who the owner of that Rashi is. And so if you look down in the block, you'll see the name of the sign, which is Gemini, and then what house it is. So in this case, ascendant or Lagna is Gemini in the South Indian chart. So that makes Cancer his second house, and he has the planet Ketu in Cancer. Leo for him is empty. Virgo is empty. Libra is empty, and so on. And in Albert Einstein's chart, if you look at it, interestingly, and we all know what an amazing genius he was, right? But he also had afflictions in his chart, right? You can see in Capricorn, Mars is very exalted there. Mars has this natural exaltation. So, and I'll get into the dignity of planets later, but Mars is very, very exalted along with Rahu, which means that tells me that he was receiving a lot of messages in a very divine way, some of his insights into physics. He arrived at those not just through this intellectual methodical study, but he was receiving these messages in a mystical way, right? And if you look at his Pisces block, you'll notice he has 4 planets in it, right? So typically, you know, when you start to see a bunch of planets in one house, you know, it can go either way for a person, right? And of course, you know, Einstein was somebody who was very obsessed with his study of physics and understanding the celestial heavens and understanding so many things about reality. He wanted to get into quantum physics and understand how human beings functioned at a subcellular, subquantum level, right? Although he called that spooky physics, but that's another topic. But what I'm trying to show you is the difference of how you read the chart. So in the North Indian style chart, you can see that Gemini, as his ascendant, is in the topmost diamond, and then you're going anti-clockwise, and you can see where his planets are kind of sitting in Pisces, right? In the diamond right to the right of Gemini, or right below Gemini. Okay. So moving on to introducing Rashis and Bhavas, right? So Rashi, as I told you, means a sign, and Bhava is a house, right? And again, this picture shows you, and I covered a little bit of this in our lecture 1, where if we look at the horoscope, or if you look at somebody's chart, and if you look at it as a Kala Purusha, the cosmic man, the divine body of Mahavishnu, right? Each house and each sign governs different body parts, correct? And so this is a beautiful pictorial or visual that I thought covered how each sign covers each body part from a perspective of Ayurveda. Okay, again, touching on those concepts. So Rashi, the sign, indicates Deha, the body or the self, the destined path of a person's important life experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, each Rashi governs an area of the body, and each Rashi also has a natural lord. Each Rashi is governed by an element. Each Rashi is governed by an Ayurvedic dosha. Each Rashi also has a gati, or a mode of movement. So there's all these complicated things that I hope that are beginning to show you guys that you can't just look at one little thing out of perspective or out of context, right? Health of a person is based on all 12 Rashis and Grahas, but we focus specifically on some of the houses more importantly than the other houses. So for example, we start to, when a person comes to us with disease or illness, we first look at their lagna, and then we look at their 6th house, 8th house, and 12th house, because those houses and those signs are going to have some paramount influence and will show the effects on a person's health, right? And that's not to say that's just it. Again, I don't want you guys to walk away with, oh, she said 6th house, 8th house, and 12th house, and that's it. That's not just it. There's other factors that come into play. Your Rashi also shows you Prakriti and when your Vikruti may change, right? Again, this is going to come from years, let me emphasize, even decades of study of understanding this, right? So I don't expect you guys to walk away with, oh, I think this person is this Rashi or whatever, but at least change your perspective to have, oh, perhaps this planet is affecting this person. What are the characteristics of this planet? What does this person's face look like? So you should start to change your perspective to be a little bit more expansive. Each graha, or a planet in a Rashi, the occupant of a Rashi, also shows how it impacts or influences a specific area in the body, and if it is in an afflicted state, how the body part is actually affected. So, for example, if the moon is afflicted, it will show a tendency towards edema, to accumulation of fluids, to storing cellular watery body fat, to showing a tendency towards kidney disease. Why? Because the moon rules blood, the moon rules fluids in the body, and so on, right? So, for example, if a person had kidney disease, would you have surgery on a full moon day? Perhaps not, right? Because their moon is affected. So those are the kind of things, again, we're getting into a very complex part of medical astrology. And so that's a whole different in-depth kind of science that we can't begin to even cover in just 3 or 4 lectures, right? Perhaps a moon that is afflicted in the mental state can show a person with some really deep fears and anxiety issues, or poor relationships with the mother, right? Because moon represents mother. Perhaps an afflicted Mars can show somebody who's always prone to cuts, burns, and surgeries. If you start to see a lot of scars on somebody's face from somebody just cutting themselves or burning themselves, and who are easily prone to pitta inflammation, then you can say that perhaps they're in an undue influence of Mars-like influences, right? And it can also be the sun, because sun is also a pitta planet, right? And we'll get into this again. An afflicted sun may show vitiligo, right, or leprosy, or skin diseases. Also, skin diseases are associated with Rahu. And so Rahu also rules addictions, right, drug addictions, alcoholism, addictions of any kind. It can be sex addictions. It can be very mental illnesses, right? But the higher qualities of Rahu can also lead a person into mysticism, or you can end up dead, you know, ODing on a drug. So I hope you're seeing sort of the paradox, the higher and the lower qualities of a planet, again, to expand your perspective. Okay, so getting into this a little bit more in detail, Rashi refers to a heap or a cluster of stars. It's named after the formation of stars such as Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, etc. And what I'd like for you all to start to understand is the symbology. What is Mesha? What is the symbol for Aries? What is the symbol for Taurus? What is the symbol for Gemini? Because in the symbology for each of the Rashis, you start to understand the quality of that Rashi, right? Some of the qualities of the Rashi. And so I want you to start to make those mental associations with, when I say Aries, it's Mesha. What does Mesha mean? It has a picture of a ram. What does Gemini mean? It represents Mithuna, which is twins. What does that mean, right? So start understanding the symbology of these. And I made this chart up just to kind of at a glance show you the gender, the Mahabhuta that is associated with the Rashi, its natural ruler, and its mode, again, of movement, right? And again, this is a technical concept of whether a Rashi is a Chala Rashi, a Sthira Rashi, or a Dvisvabhava Rashi. I just wanted you to be aware of, again, another quality or a characteristic of a Rashi, right? And know that each Rashi corresponds to one area of a physiology. Know that each Rashi has a lord or a ruling planet. Know that each Rashi has a gender. And somebody's asked a question here, how do you know if a planet's afflicted? Again, Tamara, that is a little bit beyond the scope of what we're trying to get into, right? But you will know. And when you look at a planet, if it is, and I'll get into that when we start getting into the dignity of a planet. So kind of bear with me. Just sort of receive this information and just sort of expand your perspective, if you will. And a person is, when they're born into a Rashi, what I mean is if this is their first house or their Lagna sign, then know that that person is going to possess the qualities of that Rashi. And understand, oh, is this person ruled by fire? Is this person ruled by earth? Is this person ruled by air? Or are they born into a watery sign? And you can start to associate that by observing the person's physical characteristics, right? So you know how when you look at somebody, they just look like they're very earthy, they're very grounded, whereas somebody who's very scattered and just jumping around, right, like a Vata person who's very, very airy, well, what is that like, right? So start to get into observing people and looking at their qualities. The very basic fundamental theories that we've studied in Ayurveda also apply in Jyotish, right? And so you're hopefully starting to see the correlations here. All right. Again, I'm not going to read through this chart in great detail, but this is now based on how each Rashi is associated with each part of your body. You will start to see how when you look at a person, whether or not that sign has an impact on that person. So when you look at a person whose maybe first sign is Aries, or let's say their sign is not Aries, and you see scars on their face, you see cuts and burns on their face, right? Just marks on their face. You know that perhaps that there is a pitta inflammation or that some quality of Mars is affecting them, right? And again, the scope of getting into an in-depth explanation of that far exceeds the scope of this class, but I just wanted you guys to start to understand how do the characteristics of a sign and how do the characteristics of a planet have an impact on that person. That's right, Dilek. So you are a Gemini ascendant. So how does the quality of an Aries sign affect you? How does that translate into your physical characteristic, right? So that is what I'd like for you to get into. And so please, when the lecture is loaded up on WebEx, please read through this carefully and start to understand, you know, what this means, right? And start to explore the 12 Rashis just from a general outlook. Again, don't get so microscopic into the details and arrive at some foregone conclusion based on one little thing. Know that that's not how it works, correct? And one of the things I wanted to point out is if you can remember the picture that I shared in lecture 1 of Lord Vishnu standing and how each of the signs starting from head to toe come in, the 12 Rashis come in, that's a great visual to kind of go by and start remembering what parts of the body that the Rashis rule. Okay. Moving into bhavas, and we touched on this briefly. The bhava means condition, a state of being, right? A bhava represents an area of your life. So if using the apartment metaphor, you can think of each of the 12 bhavas as representing a room in your house. So each room has its purpose. It has a general function. The kitchen is where you cook. The bathroom is where you clean yourself. You know, the bedroom is where you sleep, and so on. So similarly, each bhava has its own general function. And When we look at somebody's first house, it represents the body and their personality and their life in general. Their second house represents their aspirations to wealth, how they speak, how they communicate. And again, remember, you're not just looking at their house, you're also looking at the ruling planet, the ruling lord of that house, what sign it is, and who the occupants of that house is. So, for example, if your kitchen had cockroaches, well, it's not a very clean kitchen, correct? Or if it has a lot of dust and dirt and grime and cooking oils and stuff all accumulated, it's not a very clean house. So similarly, each room or each house is colored by its contents, who its rulers are, whether the planets in it are afflicted, what the color and quality of that house is, and how who its significator is, right? Okay. The position of the house also affects the sign, and so the Rashi also affects the bhava. So this may be a little bit complicated for you to kind of grasp your mind around, but just sit with it and kind of look at different charts, look at your chart. And again, if this were a true astrology class, I would absolutely discourage everyone from looking at their own charts and instead say, be objective, because you can never be objective about your own chart. I can promise you 100%. So I tell people to start looking at some sample charts of other people instead, so you can actually get into studying and being a little bit more objective in your observations, because we all have ideas about who we are. We can never look at our own charts objectively, ever. I can assure you it'll never happen. So when you look at this, start to look at the bhavas and rashis. Oh, is my first house Mithuna? Or is my first house, Virgo? What does that mean, right? How is this affecting my health, or how does this translate into a Rashi? What part of the body does this affect? Who are the planets in that Rashi or Bhava? And start to kind of get that bigger picture view, right, of how the Bhava is colored or affected. And again, just as with Rashis, you can see each bhava has a physiology associated with it. So you can start to appreciate the complexity of astrology, let alone medical astrology, when you start to look at it, right? So it's not just like looking and saying, first house Gemini, Mercury, Aries sign. It's also, what does the first house represent, right? So even though Gemini Rashi has specific qualities, and it affects the throat, it affects the shoulders, and the chest area. If it is the first house, you now have to look at it to see, how does Gemini affect the head, brain, hair, appearance, skin, etc. So it's almost like you're superimposing or overlaying the quality of the Rashi with the Bhava. Are you beginning to see this, how it's not just one thing, that it's really a complex association and correlation of things? Okay, I hope everybody's beginning to see this. It is complicated. That's correct, Dilek. So thank you for acknowledging that. It is complicated. So know that when you come to a conclusion, even about yourself, you're not right, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. You're beginning to now expand your mind, the way you look at things. That's all this is, right? It's a way to start to show you, wait a minute, I thought it was this, but it's really not this. There's more to the story than what I'm just seeing with my normal sight. So now you begin to start using logic. You start to correlate. You start to deduct. You start to infer and add to the picture of a patient or a client standing in front of you. I hope you're beginning to see that. And again, I don't want to read all the words into this for each of the bhavas, as long as you share the first house as Einstein. Absolutely, right? Most Gemini natives are very, very intellectual, very intelligent, interested in 3,000 million things all at the same time. But also know the lower vibrations of what that means, right? I say that, Dilek, because I'm a Gemini rising as well, so I completely understand and empathize. Anyway, so moving on. So again, understand the key words for each of the houses, right? And know what that means for the client standing in front of you. And again, I encourage you to just take some sample charts. There are plenty available on the web, and just to look at it objectively and just start applying these concepts and go, oh, first house, first bhava. Oh, here's the characteristics of the bhava. How does this now correlate to the sign, the rashi of the bhava? And then how does this now be impacted by the planets in that rashi, and so on. So you're kind of weaving and building layers of the story of a person. And you're not, again, just looking at one thing. You have to look at it in context of other things as well. Okay. Here is, I wanted to quote a couple of beautiful verses out of the Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra that tells you about the qualities and the gunas of the planets, right, and the rasas of the planets. And so please read that. I kind of created this table for you to easily infer the qualities, the dosha, the rasa of the planet. So, for example, sun rules the asti dhatu. It also rules the taste of katu, pungency, right? So what does that mean? Perhaps the sun, if you look at herbs that we've been studying in Block 3, for example, what are the qualities of those herbs and which of the planets might be most predominant? Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Like it may just be your connection, perhaps. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So getting into each of the planets, you're now beginning to understand what is the dosha of the planet. Again, it's almost like you have to meditate on the qualities of the graha. And believe me, it's taken me years just to kind of even begin to develop this sort of what I consider a very superficial awareness, right? And you have to, there are mantras for each of the planets. I begin my day with chanting all the Navagraha mantras that are the mantras for all the planets, but you're also paying your respects to the planet and acknowledging humbly how they rule your life in every aspect, and to develop this attitude of surrender and to aspire to the higher qualities of these planets, right? So with the sun, we know the sun is a fiery planet. Therefore, its dosha is pitta. What could be another fiery planet? Mars is a fiery planet, right? So you can start to see the qualities of the planet translate into their dosha. Moon is a very watery planet, but it's also a vata planet, right? Jupiter is, interestingly, the only true kapha planet, right? Whereas Venus and Moon, the other two kapha planets, also have an element of vata in them, right? So start to understand what this means. And then again, Shani and Rahu and Ketu are the other two vata planets, and you can see Mercury, in its true mercurial way, is a mix of vata, pitta, and kapha, okay? And then the gunas of each of the planets are laid out, right? Interestingly, the sun is truly a sattvic planet because it is our soul. It is our higher self. It is the journey of the soul. The moon is also a sattva planet, right? Guru, in its true nature of wisdom, is always a sattva planet, right? And Mars and Saturn are the two tamas planets, and Mercury and Venus are the two rajas planets, right? So you start to appreciate the gunas of the planets. And then, again, look at the taste of the planets, right? Jupiter, as you can see, is very fond of the sweet taste. Mercury is of mixed taste. And in some cases, the umami flavor, that is sort of the taste of mushrooms or the taste of MSG, or those, the kind of that unknown, the fifth taste sometimes, as is referred to, is also sometimes associated with Mercury. And again, please get an understanding of how the planets rule the dhatus. So if you look at the Asti Dhatu, the sun governs the bone and the bone marrow and all the minerals, right? All the life-giving minerals in a person, right? The moon rules Rakta Dhatu, the blood, the circulation of blood. Mars rules Majja. Mercury rules Rasa. Jupiter rules Medha, the fat, the insulatory properties of Guru, the things that keep us contained, that gives us insulation and protection. Venus is Shukra, rules the reproductive juices of reproductive and sexual functions within the body. And Saturn rules all the sinews, joints, and muscles of the body. So you can start to get a perspective of how planets, if they're out of balance, start to create potential imbalances in the body. So as you further your insights into Ayurveda, also start to add the perspective of the planets into your assessment process as well. And I've gotten into the details of what I just mentioned. I didn't mention Rahu and Ketu in the previous slide. Rahu rules all the cavities of the body, and Ketu rules all the body hairs inside and near the cavities. And some astrologers sort of differ on this opinion. Again, take it for what it's worth. It's not like set in stone. It's, again, a perspective for you to consider as you assess. Again, I don't want to get into each and every word of this, but please read this slide carefully so you understand what that really means at a cellular level and how it ties back to the elements. Okay, so now here we get into the dignity of a graha, right? So every planet has its own sign, its own Rashi, but it's also exalted. It reaches its highest property, its highest qualities in a sign other than its own, and that sign is referred to as a Ucha Rashi. Ucha means exalted, highest state, right? Whereas it also is debilitated. It is also in its lowest vibrational qualities in a Rashi other than its own. And that Rashi is referred to as the Nicha Rashi, or down, something that has fallen down or debilitated, right? The sun, as we know, owns Leo. It reaches its exaltation in a specific degree of Aries, and I've not included the degrees. Again, that gets into a technical Jyotish class, and it's beyond the scope of this class. I just wanted you to understand the Rashis in which planets are exalted or debilitated. And for a more technical explanation, there's more references to that, not relevant for you at this point. So the sun is exalted in Mesha, and it is debilitated in Tula, in Libra. So start to understand, what does this mean from a symbolic perspective, right? What does this mean to you? The moon owns Cancer, its own Rashi, but it's exalted in Taurus, that is owned by Venus, right? And it's debilitated in Scorpio, which is owned by Mars. So one way to look at it is Scorpio or Vrishika, that is owned by Mars, is a fiery house. It's also a watery house, but Moon, as a watery planet, is debilitated in that house. It's a fiery house. It is in its lowest vibrational qualities in that house. Mars is owns its own Rashi, and I made a mistake here. It actually no, I should have included Scorpio here along with Aries, so that was my oversight when I created this table, so I apologize. But Mars is exalted in Capricorn, the Rashi owned by Saturn, and debilitated in Cancer. That's right, Dilek. Again, try not to look at your own chart. Try to pick another chart and start to look and dissect it down in this level. So pick one house and its occupants. Try to see if the graha is in its own Rashi, is it in an exalted Rashi, is it in a debilitated Rashi. So that would be one perspective to take. Again, try not to arrive at any conclusion, simply add an element to your perspective, right? Again, Mercury, that owns Gemini and Virgo, is exalted actually in Virgo in its own sign, but is debilitated in Pisces. So if you think about it another way, Mercury is an airy sign. Mercury in a watery sign like Pisces is drowning it, right? That's one way you can think about it. Jupiter, that owns Sagittarius and Pisces, is exalted in Cancer, which is a watery sign, and debilitated in Saturn sign. So if you think of this another way, Jupiter represents expansion, growth. What does Saturn, who owns Capricorn, represent? Restriction, constriction, discipline, shutting you down, right? Coming down on you with a big stick, right? Really learning lessons about life. So they're almost in opposition with each other, right? So you can see how Jupiter would not survive or would not be able to enjoy its higher qualities in that Rashi. Same thing applies to Venus. Venus, that's a very sensuous planet. It aspires to all sensual pleasures. It owns Taurus and, sorry, again, I made a mistake here. It owns Taurus and Libra, not Pisces. And it's exalted in Pisces, that is owned by Jupiter. It's very, very exalted in Pisces, whereas it's completely debilitated in Virgo, which is a very dry and very intellectual, barren Rashi, right? It's owned by Mercury. So how would Venus, a sensual planet, enjoy or have its higher qualities in a very dry Rashi? So start to think of it that way. Saturn, again, owning Capricorn and Aquarius, is exalted in Libra, where Saturn is always about balance in life, right? Never to the extremes, right? So he's always exalted in Libra, and he's debilitated in Aries. So what does this mean? It means that somebody with Saturn in Aries is not going to be a very disciplined person. You could tell that person, okay, please take your herbs at 9 o'clock before your meal or after your meal, and they may end up forgetting about it and take it at midnight instead. You know, so that's a sign of how Saturn being debilitated in Aries can translate to in a patient's chart. So we have to be mindful. Again, it gives you a perspective when you're with a patient or when you're with a client to understand what kind of advice and what kind of medical advice you're dispensing to them. Okay. The other thing I wanted to touch on is that each planet, each graha, exerts its influence in your life through a mahadasha or through a major period. So every person goes through a major period in a specific sequence, and the sequence is listed here on this table, right? Mahadasha, maha means great, dasha means period or time period. It's a stretch of time that rules your person's lifespan and is determined by the nakshatra that you were born into. And again, I have not touched nakshatras in this lecture, and I will do so in the next lecture because it's a very vastly complicated subject. And so it's beyond the scope of this class, but I want to give you an insight into what that means. Again, one more piece of the puzzle, right? And so if you look at this table, the sun will rule a person's life for 6 years, moon will rule for 10 years, Mars 7 years, Rahu 18 years, Jupiter 16 years, and so on. Saturn being 19 years, Venus for 20 years. So if you add all of this up, it's all going to start with a total of 120 years, right? Well, no person really lives that long. Well, at least, you know, not all of it. So you can see a person is not going to get all the dashas in it. Now, remember, even within the Mahadasha, you will have subplanetary periods as well. So, for example, you could be going through a Saturn Mahadasha and have an antardasha, a sub-dasha of the moon. So all 9 planets will also be again be in a smaller time frame within a major life period. So there's that as well. So when you look at a person who's got a disease or an illness and they're coming to you, you can look at their Mahadasha and say, oh, now I see why this person's afflicted or has this disease or has been constantly ill. Perhaps they are in their Saturn period. Perhaps they are in their Ketu period, or perhaps they are in another planetary period that is afflicted. So be mindful that the Mahadasha does impact your mind-body health based on where that planet is in that person's chart and in which sign that planet is in, right? And this dasha, the Mahadasha system, is based on the Vimshotari Dasha system. Again, just adding that word just as a concept to introduce. You don't have to get into it. And I'd like to answer your question. It starts from the day you're born, but it also starts with the nakshatra that you're born. So if you are a certain nakshatra, we know which dasha period, and we look at your current age to determine, we go backwards in time to determine how many years of a Mahadasha you might have gone. So just let's assume you were born into the Mars Mahadasha. It doesn't mean you started at year 1 of Mars Mahadasha. You could have only received 2 years of the Mars Mahadasha before you moved into the Rahu Mahadasha subsequently. So does that make sense? So if you were born, you could have had up until age 2 of Mars, a Mars period, and then at age 2.5, you could have moved into your Rahu Mahadasha. So that's how you calculate it. Again, it depends on your nakshatra and how old you are and so on. Again, this is a perspective that starts to show you what lessons. So remember, when you're in a Mahadasha, your life is destined. You are destined to learn the lessons of that planet, or what that planet and its archetype shows up, or how it shows up in your life. So what does Saturn represent for you in your life? This was a reason why I wanted you guys to get into the exercise of self-awareness of how a planet has seized you, to sit with it and not arrive at a conclusion, but to really resonate, whether it's challenges, whether it's restrictions in your life. What are your shadow parts of your ego that you refuse to look at? Because we can all think that we're all great people and we're all great, lovely, nice people, but in fact, there is a subconscious part of ourselves. What are we not looking at, right? Because whatever planetary influence you're in at the moment, that is exactly the lessons that you are destined to learn, right? So please, again, start to take an introspective view of this instead of dissecting it from an intellectual standpoint. I hope you're beginning to appreciate that. All right, so your assignment, and wow, I actually ended on time. I was afraid, and I know I'm completely aware I've just dumped a whole great bunch of information on you guys. I don't want you to take it as bits and pieces of things for you to try to understand and dissect everything individually. Please take it all as parts of a bigger jigsaw puzzle. I want you to expand your perspective, your idea of darshana when you look at a patient, when you look at a client or whoever is in front of you, to develop a sense of compassion of where that person's state of suffering or where that person's state of perspective of the world is different from yours is coming from, right? So as your assignment, I'd like for you to look at your first house, only one house, right? Your Lagna Bhava. It's Rashi. We know what it represents, your Deha. Look at the occupying grahas. Look at its characteristics. Look at its rasas and gunas. And sit with it and just share a very brief assessment of your Prakriti or anybody else's Prakriti. Again, I realize that we can't not all be objective with our own Prakriti sometimes, and we need somebody else. That's why when we do those questionnaires, we ask people to have somebody else do it for us, right? Same thing applies here. Also, if you can, as I asked you earlier, when you study the Rashi, the Sanskrit words for the Rashi, instead of just saying Aries, Taurus, Gemini, which means nothing really, or you can, maybe for some of you it might mean something, look at the symbols associated with that Rashi and begin to note the correlations and the characteristics of those symbols in your corresponding houses, right? Again, expand your perspective. So those are the two things I'd like for you to share. Please, again, I encourage each of you to not come to a conclusion, because that would be very erroneous, right? Please understand that you're now adding one more layer. You're weaving a story with all these complexities of a person, a human being on the planet that is on a journey to their soul's lessons, right? And I hope you can appreciate that a little bit better. So that is the end of my lecture. Thank you for this time. I appreciate all of you listening. Yes, it is a journey of expanding your own knowledge, right, and your own awareness, and I hope you will take it as that. If there are any questions, please post them on the forum. Namaste, thank you, and have a great day.